What's up? Welcome to another episode of the Wildcast podcast. Football season is here. We're a little over a month away from the Arizona football season, which means we got the start of training camp and lots of exciting things to look forward to over the next month leading up to the season. Lots of interesting storylines for Arizona football going into not only the first year under Brent Brennan, but the first year in a new conference. Arizona joining the 16-team Big 12 conference, and lots to look forward to. I'm Justin Spears here with Michael Lev. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and comment the Wildcast podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And for all of our coverage on Arizona football, go to Tucson.com. And also check out our series, Big 12 Blitz, on Tucson.com and also in the Arizona Daily Star. We're looking at every single Big 12 school, all the details, the fight songs, the traditions, all the ins and outs, how to get there, the best places to eat. If you're a Big 12 fan, this is something that you certainly need to look at. So check it out on Tucson.com and also the Arizona Daily Star. Lev, what are your impressions of Big 12 Blitz so far?
It's an awesome series. Everyone absolutely should check it out. Greg Hansen is writing a piece on each school, and he's coming up with connections between Arizona and that school. And some of them are, I was stretched a little bit because Arizona's barely played UCF, for example, and
Sure.
a couple soccer matches, so there's not really a connection there, but he managed to find one, talking about like the one and only time that Arizona has played a football game in the state of Florida in the past, which was that 8-7 game against Miami way back in the day, which was sort of a launching pad, if you will, for the Desert Swarm. I just got my assignments for Big 12 Blitz, Justin. I've got Cincinnati and Iowa State. Those are not super relevant in the football world because Arizona doesn't play them this year. Very relevant in basketball, though. Those are two really good basketball programs. We haven't really talked or even thought that much about what basketball is going to be like in this conference, but it's going to be an all-out battle royale.
Yep.
Like, it is the deepest conference in the country. Arizona's just not going to waltz through this thing. It's going to be about they had a great home court advantage at McHale. They will still have a great home court advantage at McHale, but everyone else has a great home court advantage as well.
Yep.
You're not going to have any like half empty, Maples Pavilion where and half the fans who are there are Arizona fans. That's just not going to be the case. Going to Houston, going to Iowa State, going to Baylor, going to Cincinnati, on and on and on and on. Texas Tech's a really good basketball program, so it's going to be super fun. Those are my squads for the series, so I'm going to be working on those over the next couple of weeks here.
What was probably the most difficult place to play in the Pac-12 for Arizona basketball? Real quick, I know we're going to be talking a lot of football. Would you say it was probably Oregon or UCLA?
I feel like the trips to the Northwest. I would say the trips to the Northwest or the mountain schools were more difficult for me, my opinion, than LA. Like LA is like, it's an easy trip. It's easy to get there. You're always hyped up for those games. Like no matter how good UCLA or USC were, you're always locked in, right? Like this is kind of a big deal. Man, going up to the Pacific Northwest, you could go in the heart of winter, right? So the weather's bad. You're maybe not as fired up to play a Washington State. You're much more vulnerable to be upset by a Washington State or an Oregon State. The Colorado and Utah combo with the altitude, I think was back to back was always challenging. So to me, it was one of those. Okay. Not USC, UCLA, and definitely not Cal or Stanford either.
But in terms of fan environment, like rowdy places, I probably put Oregon up there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Oregon has a really good team, and Arizona is also really good. They certainly bring their fan base, but Stanford and Cal at Haas Pavilion, Maples Pavilion, even when Arizona is a top 15 team, in recent years, they just don't show up to watch them play. And I'm like, man, your team has an opportunity to upset the team in the Pac-12 right now, and there's just nobody there. And I feel like those days are just far behind. Even the bottom tier teams in basketball, like if UCF isn't as good, I feel like there's going to be a lot more fans in Orlando than in the Bay Area for basketball games. So it's
Yeah,
going to be a lot different.
they did well. Yeah, they did relatively well in basketball. Last year, UCF did. I think they beat Kansas
Yeah.
at their place. And it was a lot easier transition for those schools in basketball than it was in football.
Yep.
We've talked about this before. The 4 newcomers last year went a combined 8-28 in conference play.
Yep.
And I'm sure some of those wins were against each other, So it is difficult. It's not the same as it will be for Colorado, Arizona, ASU, and Utah, going from one quote unquote power conference to another, but there still will be an adjustment period. And I feel like the coaching staff was mindful of that when they went about, rebuilding the depth of the team in the offseason. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but they basically lost an entire recruiting class because of the coaching change, right? I mean, how many guys did they end up who are actual incoming freshmen? It's like 8 or 10.
Yeah.
Somewhere
Something
in
like
that range.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they had to figure out a way to replenish that. And they did it through the portal.
Yep.
And I think they did a really good job.
Well, speaking of making that transition, it's going to be very, very challenging for the Arizona football team. They're going to go to a lot of great environments like Kansas State, which is the unofficial introduction to the Big 12, right? Their official Big 12 game is at Utah in Salt Lake City, but they're getting an introduction to what the Big 12 will be in that game against Kansas State in Manhattan in September. And, training camp, we're going to see a lot of storylines here, a lot of interesting position battles, but just kind of setting the table for training camp, Lev. I feel like Arizona could have been in ultimate rebuild mode under first year head coach Brent Brennan. But in just a couple of days, Brent Brennan sold the vision of this upcoming season and what Arizona football could be to the star players, the guy who really made Arizona football so successful. And I think it says a lot about his character and how genuine he is when he can sell Arizona football and him and his coaching staff to Noah Fafita and Tetsuo McMillan and all these other guys who could have easily entered the transfer portal and followed Jetfish or follow an NIL check somewhere else. But he kept these guys here. Takario Davis, who could be a first-round pick at quarterback, the first cornerback drafted in the first round since Antoine Cason in 2008. Takario has a chance to do that. But, Takario was in the portal. He had 1 foot in, 1 foot out, was exploring his options while kind of checking things out at Arizona. And then he ultimately decided to stay at Arizona. I think there were a lot of things that went into that. I think the fact that Arizona cornerbacks coach Chip Viney being a Dwayne Walker disciple certainly helps. And Dwayne Walker was the guy who brought Takario Davis to Arizona. And I also think that this is the best training that you can get for the NFL. Every single day in practice, you are going up against the best wide receiver in college football in Tetsuo McMillan. So there were a number of factors that helped Takario Davis stay, but to get a guy like that to come back, 4 out of the 5 defensive backs returning, most of the offensive line coming back, Arizona has a lot to be hopeful for. I know there are some gaps that we'll talk about here in just a minute, Lev, but I think job well done for Brent Brennan 6 months into the gig.
Yeah, he did a couple of things that I think were really smart, and I think one of them was just that's his personality. But he doesn't. It's interesting. Most coaches, you kind of feel like they have that quote unquote type A personality, right? They're like control freaks, and they're super like kind of, they kind of take over the room, suck up all the oxygen. Brent Brennan's very chill. We've talked about this before. Like he's super laid back, kind of California guy. He didn't push too hard. He was just like, hey, let's get to know each other. No pressure. And I think that approach really helped, especially with someone like Tetsuo McMillan. You remember when T-Mac decommitted from Oregon, part of the reason that he ended up here is that the previous coaching staff kind of played it the same way. They did not put on the full court press when he was no longer committed. They kind of let him breathe a little bit. And I don't know if this coaching staff knew that, but it was clearly the right approach with him. The other smart move that I think Coach Brennan made was hiring Dwayne Aquina as the defensive coordinator, which He's a defensive backs specialist. He's a defensive backs coach who has put several guys into the NFL, and that helped them to maintain some continuity with the previous scheme. And this scheme, there's no like big mystery about how they're going to play or what your role is going to be. So I think that made it a little bit easier for someone like Takario Davis to be like, hey, I'm going to come back into the same system where I thrived last year. Dwayne Aquina is going to help me get better and get me to the league.
But there are some question marks. I think that Arizona is a bona fide top 20 team in college football, and they have a great opportunity to compete in the Big 12. And I think that their schedule favors them a little bit. I mean, there are some challenging games there, especially in the first half of the schedule, right? Going on the road to play Kansas State in Manhattan, playing Utah and Salt Lake City. Rice Eccles is always packed to the brim. You know, they've sold out a lot of games over the last several years. But man, if they're able to weather those games, I think that sky's the limit for Arizona. I mean, I think realistically, they could win 9 or even 10 games. I think that UCF game is a trap game in Orlando. That's the space game. UCF, even though I don't think they made a bowl game last year, I think they finished 5-7, but they did a really good job in the transfer portal. And they have the Big 12 preseason newcomer of the year in KJ Jefferson at quarterback. So I think that UCF game could be a trap game, but I really think that Arizona's schedule, I think they could win 9 or 10 games. Now, if they are able to get into that conversation and potentially, be looking at a Big 12 championship or even a bid to the college football playoff, I think a number of things need to work out for them. I think that offensive line, if they can find some continuity there. Now they have Josh Baker, longtime starter, back. You have Wendell Moe, who is a rising guard. I think could be potentially an all Big 12 selection. Jonas Avianea is going to be a first round pick after this year. But I'm looking at right guard and left tackle as the two most interesting spots on the O line for Arizona. Raymond Polito, I think, could be Arizona's second best offensive lineman, but he doesn't stay healthy and he's very inconsistent with his health. So if he's not available, who's going to be that guy that steps up? Is it Rhino Tapituitai? Is it Michael Wooten from Oregon? Is it Jonah Rodriguez or from San Diego State? I'm looking at left tackle and then right guard. I like Leif Magnuson, the returning guy from Canada. I thought he had a really good year last year and certainly helped out Arizona in that Alamo Bowl. They also got Shanko Matautua from New Mexico, who played at Servite with T-Mac and Noah and Jacob Manu and Kean Burnett. So there's some continuity there. Those two spots, if they can get some consistency there, and then that defensive line, they're replacing 9 scholarship defensive linemen, Lev. That's a lot of guys that you got to replace. Now, they got 7 scholarship guys in the portal, but a couple of them kind of look like project players, guys that will probably contribute either later this year or some point next year. But if that defensive line and offensive line, if they can win the trench battle, I think sky's the limit for Arizona. Hold on, Lev, you're on mute.
I'm not too worried about right guard. I think they have enough viable candidates to play that position. It's a little bit easier to play guard than it is to play left tackle. Left tackle is, this probably the second most important position on the offensive line after center. Some would argue that it's the most important position. It's protecting the quarterback's blind side. All the rave reviews and headlines and hype associated with Noah Fifita and Tetero McMillan go out the window if you can't protect your quarterback.
They showed that in the Alamo Bowl.
Yeah, they sure did. So, I mean, this is a very important spring, or this important training camp, I should say, for someone like Raymond Polito.
Yeah.
Because he really has to prove himself worthy of that position. He was a big-time recruit. At one point was committed to Alabama. He's clearly got great size and athleticism, but like you said, he's had trouble staying on the field. And then the one time that we did see him in extended action, at that position, it was a major struggle in the Alamo Bowl. So this is a really big spring for him, or big training camp for him. We didn't get to see him much in the spring because he was banged up with some sort of a lower body ailment. So big for him. They did bring in some reinforcements, though. You mentioned some of them. Jonah Rodriguez is one of them, a transfer from San Diego State. Michael Wooten is another one, transfer from Oregon. These guys were, pretty highly rated recruits when they came out. They were people of interest. Now they're here. I like the idea of betting on pedigree, betting on talent, and you are going to rely on your coaching staff to coach these guys up. That's kind of the way that Brent Brennan has operated and succeeded over the years. We're able to get a lot of 4 and 5 star recruits at San Jose State. If you look at the 2025 recruiting class right now, it's all 3-star guys. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you have a coaching staff that can evaluate and develop talent, that can take you a long way. We like what we've seen so far from Josh Oglesby as an offensive line coach. You put your faith in him that he's going to be able to figure it out with that group.
On the defensive side of the ball, though, that was a point of emphasis during the last cycle. And I find this so interesting, Lev. It's like it's deja vu all over again, right? Like last year, we're like, okay, well, how's the defensive line going to look? Who's going to be the second linebacker right next to Jacob Manu? And now we're right back at it. Defensive line, that was probably the most important element to Arizona's success last year because, in 2022, while they had significant improvement on the offensive side of the ball and they had one of the top passing offenses in college football, on the defensive side, I mean, how many games did they give up over 300 yards rushing? I mean, they were essentially like turnstiles on the defensive line, and they allowed a lot of rushing yards. They were one of the worst rushing defenses in college football. If I'm not mistaken, I think they were the 8th worst rushing defense in 2022. And then they rose up to, I think, top 30 last year. So that's a pretty significant improvement. And that's because those defensive linemen were able to consume space and not get any pushback. And it allowed Jacob Manu and Dalton Johnson and Traden Stukes and all these other skill players to make plays at the line of scrimmage or even behind the line of scrimmage. And I think that the defensive line last year was so important to Arizona's success. But man, they're going to have a whole new batch of guys coming in. And I think if they can replicate a little bit of what they did last year, they'll be just fine. But there's a lot of question marks there.
So what I like about what they've done is they've thrown a lot of resources at the problem, right? I kind of sketched out like a 3 deep along the defensive line. This is just pretty pure speculation. And I've also assigned positions to the guys, even though Joe Ciamalu, the defensive line coach, said that they're all just defensive linemen and he kind of moves them around. But, when I look at this list, almost everyone on here is a veteran player. They're all either returning players or transfers or people that, Arizona's kind of brought up through the pipeline a little bit. I'm going to run through it for you. And when I do, you kind of get an idea of they really do have a lot of guys.
Yeah.
Whether they're going to be good, like Big 12 caliber players on a consistent basis, that remains to be seen. But here's who I wrote down for a weak side defensive end: Chase Kennedy, promising transfer from Utah; Dominic Lolesio, and Sterling Lane. Sterling Lane, probably the biggest recruit of any of these guys. Again, another one who has a lot to prove, but did show some promising signs in the spring. At the 3 technique defensive tackle, I put down Jara Anderson. I put down Kevon Darton, and you're going to have to help me probably with the pronunciation, but Stanley Ta'ufo'u from USC. The kind of your slightly undersized, but hopefully quick and penetrating defensive tackles. At the nose tackle, Chuba Ma'e, Isaiah Johnson, and Keanu Mailoto. And then at the strong side defensive end, I've got Tai Yungalale, Trace Smith, and Lance Kennelly, who is another transfer, this one from Stanford.
Yep, Dwayne Akina guy.
Right, Dwayne Akina guy. So, I mean, that's 12 seemingly viable defensive linemen that I just rattled off there, right? And if you can get 8 of those guys to hit, 2/3 of them, you're in pretty good shape. And that doesn't even, account for a young guy like Nick Fernandez or Tristan Davis or Cyrus Durham, who flashed a little bit in the spring. So, like I said, they have thrown resources at the problem. They've rebuilt the depth, which is super important. I mean, that was absolutely critical element of that defense last year, is they, for the first time and since I've been on the beat or been, in Tucson, instead of just saying that you're going to have a defensive line rotation, they actually had and
Yep.
implemented a legitimate defensive line rotation, and it made all the difference in the world. Remember at the end of that, at the Alamo Bowl, you were probably busy writing at this time, but this game was a little bit out of hand, and Oklahoma had to pass. They had no choice but to pass at this time of the game, late in the fourth quarter. Guys were still chasing after the quarterback.
Yep.
You know, like you're talking game 13, last 5 minutes of the last quarter. And guys were pursuing, they were hustling, they were getting after it. And that's because they still had enough energy, because, thanks to the rotation that they were able to implement last year and that they're trying to replicate this year.
But maybe a little bit different styles with the defensive line, because one thing about Johnny Nansen was, even though the defensive line was steady, you didn't see a lot of guys playing aggressive. It was very smart, very strategic. Like, we're just going to stay at the line of scrimmage, clog up the lanes, and allow guys like Taylor Upshaw or Jacob Manu, those kind of guys, to get to the quarterback. Joe Ciamalo's like, hey, everyone downhill. We have one mode, and that's downhill, get to the quarterback. I'm curious if that's going to help Arizona or if that's going to be a liability. So two different coaching styles.
Yeah, it might. I mean, one of Johnny Nansen's big things was to limit big plays,
Yeah.
right? So they played a lot more zone than we had seen before. And they were a little more like, hey, occupy blockers and let guys make plays up front. As you mentioned, Joe Ciamalo advocates more of an attacking style, more of a penetrating style. So I feel like it could lead to a little bit more of a boom or bust type of result, where maybe they're going to get more tackles for loss, maybe they'll force some more turnovers, but they might also give up some big plays in the process.
Yeah.
So depends on what flavor you prefer, whether that trade-off is acceptable to you.
And one thing I will add about defensive line before we move to linebackers and other position groups, but I think that some people will probably look at the stats of these guys coming in and think, man, this is very underwhelming. Like, we are not getting any production on the defensive line. Why should we count on these guys? Well, Bill Norton was kind of in the same boat. Bill Norton, when he came over from Georgia last year, didn't have any stats. We didn't know what to expect out of him. And then he turned out to be one of the most valuable defensive players that Arizona has. So is it because they're not good, or because they didn't get a lot of opportunity? We'll see that this year. And then also, there's just rising players that are getting mature, getting more experience, and sometimes they just pop at the right time. Like Isaiah Ward was that guy last year. On the first, or the 2022 season, Isaiah Ward was nowhere on anybody's depth chart. And then he had a really good spring, really good training camp, and established himself as that other edge rusher. I think you're really going to see that with guys like Tai Uiagalelei, who has been kind of like the unofficial fifth starter for Arizona on the defensive line over the last couple of years. I think he really establishes himself as a starter. And I've heard nothing but great things about Isaiah Johnson. I mean, this staff, they love this guy. He's been banged up over the last couple of years, but look for him to be a force in the interior. And I think Chuba Ma'ai, too. He lost about 30 pounds, looks very light on his feet, carries his weight well. And then when you add in Big Stanley from USC and Kayvon Darton from Syracuse, those guys are entering their sixth year of playing college football. Having sixth-year defensive linemen a part of that rotation, I think that's an ideal scenario for Arizona.
Yeah, I agree. I had slotted him in at the strong side defensive end, but he could very easily play that three technique position inside. He has played all over the line. Extremely valuable and promising player. Regarding Chuba Ma'ai and Isaiah Johnson, you need some 300 plus pounders.
Yeah.
In modern college football, you just do. And the more you have, the better. so they don't have to play as many snaps. I don't know how many snaps Chuba played when he was at UC Davis, but I'm guessing that it was more than they were going to ask him to play here.
Much more.
This is a player who's going to play, ideally, 50% of the snaps or less. And if things work out really well the way you want them to, only a handful of guys are going to play like more than 50%. And those guys might be like a Trey Smith, who, might very well be the breakout player in that group. Kind of broke out last year already at San Jose State, and Ty is another one who I think you'd want to get a lot of playing time. Everyone else, hey, it's a rotation, and you will benefit from the rotation because you will be fresh, and the guys you're playing against will be tired.
Now, taking a step back and going to the linebacker position, we already know about Jacob Manu. Danny Gonzalez, the linebackers coach and special teams coordinator, he said, I got the best linebacker in the Big 12. And Jacob Manu is a preseason all Big 12 selection, led the Pac-12 in tackles last year with 116. He even said, I don't lead the Pac-12 in tackles if it wasn't for the defensive line. But Jacob Manu, we already know what we're getting out of him. What about next to him, the Mike linebacker spot? I mean, there are a few options. Kamuela Kaihu, the sophomore from Hawaii, Tay Brown, the sophomore from Chandler. And you also have Justin Flo, who was a former highly touted recruit, a 5-star All-American, went to Oregon. Things didn't work out well for him there. Then comes to Arizona, had a little bit of magic there towards the middle of the season, had a breakout game against Mississippi State with 12 tackles, proved to be a really great run stopping and explosive tackler, but would often get lost in pass coverage. So I'm not going to say that Justin Flo is a one-trick pony, but if there's anything that he could do very well at, it's rushing the passer, getting through the line of scrimmage and making plays, whether it's tackling ball carriers or getting to the quarterback. I think that that's going to be his calling. I compared his potential role to Micah Parsons for the Dallas Cowboys. Will he start at that other linebacker spot? Who knows? I'm probably willing to bet that it's going to be Tay Brown, just because he was the most consistent guy at the middle linebacker spot in the spring. But, I think that even though Tay Brown could take over that spot, I still think there are opportunities for guys like Justin Flo, Kamuela, and even Leviticus Sua.
I think that they're all going to play. All being Justin Flo, Kamuela, and Tay Brown.
Yeah.
I at least early in the season, I'm going to predict that Tay and Kamuela split the reps there, and that they find a role like you described for Justin Flo. Like, you're going to be like sort of a specialist, a third, might be part of a package, maybe some sort of new third down package where he's basically going to rush the passer. He's going to use his explosiveness. He's going to use his athleticism. He's not going to have to read and react to whatever's happening. It's just like, hey, go get that guy right there, run him down, take him out. I think he could really thrive in that kind of role. And, Dwayne Aquina is a smart defensive coordinator. He has a former head coach in Danny Gonzalez and former, defensive coordinator at pretty high level programs on his staff. They will figure this out, and they will figure out the best way to utilize their personnel. And the beauty of it is, like, you don't have to necessarily say we have to get this one guy to play the spot. Like, Manu's going to be there. Manu is a constant. Yep. Manu is in on every single defensive play if he's healthy at that weak side linebacker spot. You can go kind of piecemeal and platoon at the other position, and you can sometimes just figure out a role for a guy that might not be, something that just, easily fits into our perception of the depth chart.
And maybe Justin Flo's role is kind of similar to what Jeremy Mercer had last year, where he's kind of like the quarterback spy, outside linebacker / edge rusher, which was really effective against Washington State. That was the double eagle flex defense that Dwayne Aquina introduced to Arizona from his time coaching in the Canadian Football League. And from that point forward, once they added Jeremy Mercer in the game, Washington State did not score a single point. So I think that's a bonus for Arizona where, you're not sure what to do with Justin Flo, but you have certain defensive packages to where if a team goes 12 personnel or runs the ball very well or has a quarterback that's mobile and can get out of the pocket, you could throw that extra guy in who can kind of contain. And I think Justin Flo had a similar role against USC, if I'm not mistaken. Like he was getting up in Caleb Williams's grill a handful of times in
Yes,
that game.
and committing penalties for late hits as well. Quick aside. So I'm working on my AP top 25 and trying to
Ooh,
figure out Miami. I'm kind of bullish on Miami this year. Feel like they might exceed expectations. Could even win the ACC. They have Cam Ward now, who's one of the most sought after quarterbacks in the transfer portal. But I have it in the back of my mind that game from last year. Like they completely neutralized him and that offense. So
yeah.
it worries me a little bit. Like if there's a certain defensive look that just kind of paralyzed this guy. I have no idea. Like, is it his fault? Is it the coaches? Like, were they just, did they have some sort of sense of defeat that kind of sunk in at some point in the game? But it's given me a little bit of pause when it comes to Miami. But yeah, that flex defense, I like the idea of having a handful of packages. Like Don Brown, God bless his soul, he was a great guy to have from a media standpoint, and he actually did a pretty darn good job considering what he had to work with the 1 year he was here. But God, they had so many defensive packages. Like guys were running, it was like hockey line changes,
Yeah.
and they'd get delayed. They'd have to call timeout, or they'd get delayed game penalties. Under Johnny Nansen with Dwayne Aquina working alongside of him, they came up with just a handful, right? You got that flex, you got the dollar package, and base and your base. And those were kind of the only personnel changes that they would make. I think you want to keep that number at a reasonable amount because you don't want the players to have to think too much
Yep.
out there.
Well, speaking of dollar package, very defensive back heavy package that uses 7 DBs. That's been very effective for Arizona over the last couple of years. And I think that that's going to be a staple under new defensive coordinator Dwayne Aquina. But the secondary in the base defense, that's going to be an interesting storyline this year because we already know about 4 out of the 5 guys, right? Takario Davis, star cornerback. You have a great safety tandem in Gunnar Maldonado and Dalton Johnson. Gunnar, in my opinion, I think is the most improved defensive player over the last year or so. I know Jacob Manu is a stud, but if we're talking about where they were at versus where they're at now,
Yeah, how it started, how it's going.
yeah,
Yeah.
straight up. Like
Mm-hmm.
Gunnar Maldonado, we were talking about like, man, should this guy start? I mean, he had earned the starting spot in training camp last year with Isaiah Taylor and DJ Wardell and all those guys competing for him.
Everybody wanted him to be benched.
Yep.
You could not talk to a fan who wanted to stick with Gunnar Maldonado after the first handful of games last year.
Yep. I think,
And they kept telling us like might not necessarily be his fault what you're seeing. He might be covering up for somebody else's mistake and that sort of thing. But I don't know, he figured it out. He turned it around. You've quoted the missed tackle percentage stat, which is one of my favorite ones. Like he cut that number in half.
it's insane.
Like the light bulb clicked on for Gunnar, which was really nice to see.
Became Alamo Bowl MVP for what you coined the Maldonado Mad Dash, which
Yep.
I will shout for the mountaintops because I think that's brilliant. You got the leap by the lake, you got Chuck Cecil's pick six, and you got the Maldonado Mad Dash. I'll put Chuck Cecil's pick six number 1 just because it was against ASU in a very important game. But
Yeah.
Gunnar made one of the most important plays in program history, which you wrote about.
Top
And
5 for sure.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And
So
I think
then you mentioned those 3 guys, Traden Stukes.
is the most
Another,
underrated DB in the Big 12.
yeah, so last year I wrote a column. I think I'm going to make it an annual tradition now where I kind of decided who's the most underrated player in the team or the most underrated player in the league. I said Michael Wiley last year. He didn't end up having a great year because he was injured for a long stretch, but obviously a really, really good player. I think Traden Stukes is going to be that guy for me.
100%.
He's
100%.
like, he's understated. You're not really sure, like, what position does he play? He's just a really good football player and a really good athlete as well, who I think is going to test better than anyone expects when that time comes. But the question is, Justin, where is he going to play? Right?
I don't know. I think honestly, if I'm judging or if I'm looking into everything that Dwayne Aquina is saying, at Arizona under Dwayne Aquina, you're not a cornerback, you're not a star, you're not a safety, you are a defensive back. And Arizona is going to put out the 5 best defensive backs no matter what. And me personally, I don't know what these newcomers have, like Demetrius Freeney, the transfer from Miami. There's some other guys in the mix there. Jay Avion Celestine is a returner who's competing in that role. I just think honestly, if I'm looking at the best 5 defensive backs, I'm putting Traden Stukes back at corner, and then I'm putting this lanky, super athletic Genesis Smith at that star role because he came in as a safety, but his size, his athleticism, the production that he showed last year, he got an interception in that Alamo Bowl game. I think you could put him in at that star position, have Traden go back to cornerback. And me personally, I think those are the 5 best defensive backs that Arizona has.
It comes down to what is your philosophy? Is your philosophy best 5 and we'll sort of figure out the positions later? Or is it, hey, we want to designate certain positions for certain guys? If it's the former, then I think you're right. I think Genesis Smith is definitely one of their 5 best. We know who the other 4 are. So boom, done deal.
Yeah.
Like those are your starters. If it's the latter, then you're looking at Demetrius Freeney, transfer. You're looking at Marquise Groves Killebrew, who was a one-time, big-time recruit who I guess he's kind of bounced around a little bit. He's had some injury issues. He's been at Louisville. He's been at Texas A&M. Now he's here. John O'Price, who's a JC transfer. Emmanuel Carnley, who is a recruit from the previous staff, who's got nice size at 6'3". You're kind of, and then G7, Javian Celestine is the other one. You're kind of, hey, tossing the ball out there and seeing who wins the battle. So that's the problem that needs to be solved in the back end. But I would say, like, relative to the other issues on defense, I'd say it's probably the least of my concerns because that group's going to be really solid, and having 4 of the 5 starters return gives you a jump start and having a really great defensive backfield.
And something that the defensive backs coach could tell these guys if they're not given the starting role is, hey guys, we run a dollar package defense against pass-centric offenses. We're going to have 7 DBs
2 more
out
guys.
there.
Yep.
So stay locked in because guess what? You're going to be a very important part of our defense, and you're going to be playing some pretty significant snaps this upcoming season. So I think that's what's going to be great for Arizona, even if, Celestine or Carnley or Groves Killebrew, even if these guys aren't in the starting lineup, I fully expect them to get some playing time this upcoming season.
Yeah, and I think another name that's just worth mentioning when it comes to the package is maybe Jack Luttrell, who's a safety, a transfer from Tennessee. The extra defensive backs, they aren't necessarily corners. They could be safeties as well, or as you said earlier, like Dwayne Aquina, he might just view everybody as a defensive back. Like he was very big on that. To give the background on that, he said to us, everywhere he had ever been, all the guys were in one room, and when he came here, the cornerbacks were in one room and the safeties were in another room. He didn't like that. So he brought them all back together again. He likes the idea of an entire secondary unit, and it makes a lot of sense because those guys have to work together, especially when you play zone as much as Arizona did last year. Like there has to be like a high level of communication among those guys.
And now Arizona has gotten so great at communication that they don't need to communicate. That was one thing that Gunnar Maldonado noted was really towards the end of the season, even in the spring, him and Dalton Johnson were always on the same page mentally, and they could read each other, knew exactly where that other person was going. I think that kind of continuity is going to pay dividends for a defense where, defensive line, that's rebuilding. That's a big question mark. I really think that the defensive secondary, that's going to be the heart and soul of Arizona's defense.
I love hearing that. When you can reach that level of quote unquote communication where you don't even have to necessarily talk to each other. You can just see it and know what you're supposed to do and what the other guy is going to do. And additionally, you mentioned this in your preview of the defense for training camp, but they're going to blitz a little bit more, I
Yeah.
think, with this staff versus the previous. And if you feel good about your defensive backs that they can cover one-on-one, you can take more chances up front. So again, I think they're going to take a few more risks under this regime than they did the previous, and hopefully, you get the benefits of that, and it doesn't end up in just you're giving up a bunch of big plays.
Going back to offense, Lev, looking at the skill players outside of Noah Fafita, you got a great running back room. I think Ja'Cory
Loaded.
Cross-Merritt, Quali Conley, I mean, two guys who were some of the best rushers in the Mountain West. Ja'Cory Cross-Merritt had 17 rushing touchdowns a year ago. Getting him to come out to Arizona, that is a huge addition. So, I mean, they lost Michael Wiley, Jonah Coleman, DJ Williams, who had the knockout punch in the Alamo Bowl. Losing those three guys was huge for Arizona. That was a huge loss. And, you looked at the guys that they brought back. I think Rayshon Speedy Luke will have a bigger role this year. I think that maybe he was, potentially misused by the previous staff, or maybe he just wasn't developed. He had to take a couple of years to build up his body and get some weight on his small frame. And now that he's had that experience, maybe now is the time for him to really break out and have a role. I've been playing College Football 25, the video game, and man, those swing passes, those screens to Speedy Luke and getting his 97 speed out into open space, it's very effective, Lev. And I think Quali Conley and even an underrated guy like Kedrick Riscano, who was a highly touted recruit coming out of high school, didn't have the success he wanted to at Ole Miss. Meg, we were looking at Brandon Johnson, the redshirt freshman, getting into that rotation, and now he's going to be like maybe the fifth guy in that rotation. So that shows just how loaded Arizona's running back room is.
It is a robust room, and we did not have in the spring Ja'Cory Cross-Merritt or Kedrick Riscano. They were not on the roster at that point. The issue with Ja'Cory Cross-Merritt was a little complicated. There was some uncertainty about whether he still had eligibility. He was here, and then he committed somewhere else, and he came back. Now it seems like it's a done deal. He's locked in. Super duper productive player at New Mexico last year. Very shifty and explosive. I think he'll be a really good complement to Quali Conley, who's I think a little bit more of the kind of the Michael Wiley type, like not super flashy, but very productive at the same time. And then you sprinkle in some Rayshon Luke and in certain packages and certain plays, screen passes, swings. Maybe you get him somehow isolated on a linebacker, on a wheel route or something, and utilize his speed to your advantage. And then you bring in this kid, Kedrick Riscano, was again like a very highly touted recruit. And I hope that the plan that they've laid out for him is, hey, look, two of these guys have one more year of eligibility, so be patient, bide your time. Come next year, you'll have a chance to be the man. Because kids are impatient these days, and if they don't get to play right away, they're going to look elsewhere. And this is a topic for another day, but with the roster expansion that is coming to college football, I think the transfer portal next year is going to be like even crazier, than it was before, which is like, I don't know. It's
Are you going to have like
to comprehend.
walk-ons, like taking a chance and getting into the portal, and maybe a team gives them a scholarship? Is that what
I
you're
don't know.
saying?
I think there's definitely going to be sort of a trickling up effect. Ohio State's got 20 more spots. I can go, be an Ohio State Buckeye. Whether you're going to get to play, if you're the 97th man on the team, that's another issue, but that might be appealing for some guys. And then there'll probably sort of be like the reaction to that, which is, a bunch of these guys aren't playing, so they're going to transfer somewhere else where they can play. But I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just kind of this constant fluidity of college football. I know how much you love that. Right after the season's over, Justin, having to deal with all those personnel issues, but it's just hey, that's the way the sport is. And look, if there wasn't for the transfer portal, Arizona would be in trouble,
Yeah.
right? With all the guys that they lost
Yep.
to Washington, all the recruits that they lost and the depth that they lost, that thanks to the transfer portal, they were able to replenish. And that includes the running back position, where they look loaded at the moment.
What about tight ends? How do you feel about that group? Because I think Roberto Miranda, am I is he going to be Antonio Gates? I mean, he looks good in that number 85 jersey. He's only got one reception in his entire Arizona career, which was against ASU, and that was kind of like Jed Fish throwing his guy a bone for like, "Hey, thanks for your loyalty. Thanks for being a great run blocking tight end. Here's a
Yeah,
reception. Here's a stat for you." But man, he looked really good in the spring
he
as a
did.
pass catching tight end. Like I said, is he going to be Antonio Gates? No, but I expect a lot more catches and a lot more yards from Mr. Roberto Miranda. And I also think Kean Burnett could be in for a breakout year too. And I really like Sam Olsen, the transfer from San Jose State. I think that those are going to be your top three tight ends, with guys like John Hart and Dylan Tapley and
Dorian
Tyler Powell
Thomas.
and Dorian Thomas also in the mix as well.
Yeah, again, that's a well-stocked group. One of the things I'm going to monitor early in the season is how much does the third wide receiver play versus the second tight end? Like, what is the usage rate for those players compared to before? I feel like I'd have to look this up, but I think probably the number one formation or personnel grouping that Jed Fish utilized was 3 wideouts, 1 running back, 1 tight end. We saw a lot of 12 personnel, 2 tight ends in the spring. So it might turn out that second tight end position is more of a starter than the third wide receiver position in this system. And there's a lot of good candidates to play those spots. You mentioned Roberto Miranda had a very good spring. He was a big time athlete coming out of Germany. Obviously, growing up there, playing football overseas, not more raw as a prospect than most of the kids who come in, through the high school system, who've participated in all these camps and that sort of thing.
Hold on,
But he
before you
seems pretty,
move on, Lev.
yeah.
I know it doesn't really happen often, but shout out to Kevin Sumlin and his staff for finding him.
They did.
Yeah.
No, it's true. Hey, a handful of the guys who are on this roster were Kevin Sumlin gets or recruits. We're pretty sure Traden was.
He was. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so is Jordan Morgan.
Yep.
So is Michael Wiley. So, it's not like they had no eye for talent whatsoever. There were just a lot of other issues that coaching regime had. But yes, Roberto Miranda he's from the previous two regimes previous. He seems pretty locked into one of those spots. They brought in Sam Olsen from San Jose State. So this is someone that they know, who has played a lot for this coaching staff. He's going to get a lot of run. The most interesting guy to me at that position in training camp is Kean Burnett. Kean Burnett came in as a big-time recruit. He's part of the Servite 4 with Jacob Manu and Tetero McMillan, and of course Noah Fafita. And he was a bigger recruit based on star rating than either Fafita or Manu, right? And really hasn't had a consistent role so far. But you see flashes of his athleticism, his ability to catch the ball down the field, run up the seam or run a post route and beat a linebacker or a safety. Big training camp for Kean Burnett to prove himself, to establish himself, to rise to the top at what is now a pretty, competitive position for them.
At wide receiver, the Cats are losing Jacob Cowing, very productive slot receiver. There are some interesting candidates there. I like Malachi Riley, who is very, very quick, had a great spring, really good route runner. Bobby Wade and Brent Brennan both love Malachi Riley. The players too, Noel Fafita and others, they love this guy. So I would imagine if Arizona is going to have a 3 wide receiver starting lineup, I'd probably guess it's going to be Tetero McMillan, Montana Lamonius Craig, and Malachi Riley. But they also added some weapons too. Jeremiah Patterson was a very productive receiver at San Mateo Community College, which it has kind of turned into a D1 factory. A lot of players are coming from San Mateo, so that's a really good pipeline to establish there if you're going the JUCO route. Raymella Murphy at Old Dominion, he's got connections to Noah Fafita and Tetero McMillan. Uh, Raymelo he's from the Bay Area or from Northern California. And then during COVID, because certain counties had restrictions in Northern California, Raymelo was unable to play in NorCal. So he decided to trek down to Los Angeles, and he played at Santa Margarita High School and played against Noah Fafita in TMAC in high school. They also trained together. They did 7-on-7s together as well. So there's a connection there. And when you look at his numbers at Old Dominion, he was 27th in college football in yards per catch at just under 20 yards. So he's a slot receiver. He's at, I think, 6 foot, 185 pounds, if I'm not mistaken. And I look for Mello to be one of those guys in that mix. But, Brent Brennan said it at Big 12 Media Days that there are, quote, plenty of options there with the guys that they got in the 2024 recruiting class. Also guys that are, ascending the ranks, the guys that are considered underclassmen. They're going to have some weapons there that could surprise a lot of people.
Yeah. Raymelo Murphy is a slot receiver on paper based on the way his sort of body type. But when you look at his usage at Old Dominion, he was lined up wide 88.1% of the time and only 11.9% in the slot. So it would be a new position,
like an Antonio Brown,
for him to learn. Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see how they deploy these guys. I mean, look, you can use someone like Lamonius on the inside, right?
Yeah.
If you want to. You can use Tetero McMillan on the inside if you want to. It just depends on how do you view the inside receiver? Is it a little quick guy? I've seen coaches use a bigger receiver in that position to create some matchup issues, or sometimes you might want that bigger body in there as a blocker, right? In certain types of run schemes. So again, is it as important a position as it was in the previous offensive system, because you're going to be using two tight ends a lot? Do you need that third receiver as much? It is definitely an important position. It's not like they're not going to use three wideouts, and it is definitely one of the more interesting position battles to watch. Someone like an AJ Jones, who's sort of a forgotten guy in the grand scheme of things, I feel like deserves to get some looks. He is not what you think of when you think of a slot receiver, but the idea of having Montana Lamonius Craig at 6'2", 200 pounds, Tetero McMillan at 6'5", 210, and AJ Jones at 6'4", 210 out there as your three wideouts. I mean, that's like a basketball team.
Yeah.
And you pair that with a big tight end as well, that can create its own set of matchup problems. So I think the receiving core is going to have a different look and vibe around it without a Jacob Cowing in the mix this year. But different doesn't necessarily mean worse or less productive.
You bring up Cowing. He was also Arizona's starting punt returner last year, and Arizona will have to replace him at slot and also punt returner. Very underwhelming as a punt returner, but had two very important punts in that game against Oregon State a year ago, which set Arizona up for a couple of fourth quarter touchdowns.
It's hard. It's hard to return punts these days because the punters, a lot of the schools, especially a lot of schools in the Big 12, they have these Australian punters who have that rugby style, and they're able to get great hang time, and they're able to place the ball in such a way that it just makes it hard to generate good returns, period. I am looking forward to the day, and I'm sure it's coming sooner than later, where college football is going to adopt what the NFL is doing this year, kind of bringing the kickoff back into play by shifting where the tacklers are lined up and making it a safer play, but also a more viable play. I think that'll be great for the NFL, and college football is going to adopt it. And when that day comes, that position of kickoff returner is going to go from kind of an afterthought, which it is now, to a much more, important figure when you're just trying to figure out your football team.
And I think that college football is slowly adopting more NFL stuff. We're starting to see it with the coach to player communication in the helmets, a
2-minute
2-minute
warning.
warning,
When
tablets on
you're
the sidelines now.
when you were playing your first couple of games in college football 25, I bet you that 2-minute warning caught you by surprise, right?
It threw me for a loop. It threw me for a loop for sure. And yeah, I think that, that it's great that, they're adding all these elements. I think Connor Stallions had a little bit to do with the coach to player communication in the helmets. I don't think that's a big coincidence, but and now they're making a Netflix documentary off of that, which I find very funny. But sticking on special teams, Tyler Loop could go down as one of the best Arizona kickers, if not the best Arizona kicker of all time. I was actually talking with Lucas Haversick. He played at my golf tournament over the weekend, and he was like, I think this Tyler Loop guy has a legitimate shot to have a great NFL career.
Mm.
And he currently sits 12th all time in college football history at just over 86% field goal rate. So he doesn't really miss. He extended his range last year, got a couple of 50 plus yarders. His career long is 52. Had a walk-off field goal against Colorado,
Yep.
which is the first walk-off field goal for Arizona since Casey Scouring against Washington in 2014. And, you want to talk about unsung heroes in that Alamo Bowl. Tyler Loop made 3 field goals in that game, which is tied for the most by a Wildcat in a bowl game. So we talk about the play with Maldonado. We talk about the offense. Tyler Loop was just kind of in the background, like, hey, I'm Mr. Consistent. I'm making these field goals, and I think he's going to stamp his Arizona career as one of the best.
Here's the question: is he also going to be the punter?
That's another thing too.
Like you cannot rule out that possibility, because they go into training camp like really with a wide open punter battle. We do not know who is going to play that role. It could be Tyler Loop pulling double duty. It could be Cash Peterman, who the transfer from BYU, Arizona kid. It could be Jordan Forbes, who's a walk-on from Mesa, or there's one more candidate, right? And that is the freshman, Michael Salgado Medina from Mission Viejo, which is a powerhouse program in Southern California where Arizona's done very well in recruiting. He comes in as a kicker / punter. Tyler Loop did both, if I recall, his freshman year. So it could be the kid, could be the freshman. That is a wide open race. You do not want your preseason all conference kicker to also have to punt.
Yeah, Tyler Loop's had a weird career at Arizona. So his first year, he was just the punter. He didn't kick. I think it was Lucas Haversick who was kicking.
Yeah, I think was that the year that Kyle Ostendorp was injured?
Yeah,
I think that was, yeah.
Well, Matt Aragon, I think also kicked because Kyle Ostendorp came in 2019.
Well, this was 2020.
Yeah, 2020.
When Loop was the primary punter.
Yeah.
I know Ostendorp, one year he was banged up and just really couldn't do it. And hey, man, Loop was good at it too. Like, it's not like he was just a fill-in kind of makeshift punter. Like, he was effective at it. But I've heard from many people when I've questioned, like, like when the NFL, when the kicker gets injured in the game or whatever, and they're like having position players like try to do it. I'm always like, why can't the punter do this?
Yeah.
And many people have told me that it's just two different disciplines, like the style of kicking, the type of kicking. To me, it's like, hey, you've got all this time in practice. You should be able to do both. Those guys just
I agree.
Goof off like half the time. So
I agree.
Maybe you should like have that as a contingency, just as part of your special teams program. But like I said, Tyler Loop was good at punting, but I don't think you want him to be the punter. You'd much rather have somebody else emerge in that role.
Maybe it's Salgado Medina. Didn't really put up the sexiest numbers at Mission Viejo. I think he was just under 40 yards per punt, but he did have a career long of 61.
I got two words for you. Marine layer.
Oh,
it is very hard. It is much harder to kick for distance in Southern California, especially at night when it gets wet. And there's that kind of heavy, moist air than it is to kick here in Arizona. and you're not going to encounter the Marine Layer anymore in the Big 12. I got news for unless, I don't know, maybe, or Houston could be kind of sticky and humid sometimes, maybe in Orlando, but I think that you'd be surprised how much of a difference that can make for a punter or kicker.
If Tyler Loop is punter and kicker, first Wildcat to man both duties since Nick Folk in 2006, which is, pretty good company to be in, right? You want to be considered, in the Nick Folk category, one of the greatest kickers in U of A history, has carved out a nice NFL career. You want to replicate that, but that's also very troubling for Arizona.
No, I know you definitely not something that you want to be the case. You want your kicker who, like you said, has NFL talent and aspirations to focus on that one thing and just be really, really good at that. Let someone else handle the punting chores. So I think ideal world, one of the other three guys takes the reins, takes over the job and does a really good job. And Tyler Loop doesn't have to worry about it. You kind of have that as a fallback option if need be.
But what if Salgado Medina is the punter and he's the successor to Tyler Loop for next
That's
year?
okay. Hey, Loop did it. Loop showed the way, right? He, like you said, he was a punter to start out with, and he made the transition to kicker.
That's true.
That's fine. That's totally fine. You can find another punter. We're talking about this season, and the best thing for this season is anyone else but Tyler doing that job.
Yep.
Also, it's just like a lot of wear and tear on your leg.
Yeah.
Too,
Also, shout out to Kyle Ostendorp for working for NASA. He's like, I'm not going to go to the NFL. I'm going to go build rockets and live in Houston and work for NASA. He's going to.
Those are about, punter in the NFL is a really hard job to get, right? There's only 32 of them. Kicker is a hard job to get. Working for NASA, that is also a really difficult job to get. So kudos to Kyle. We knew he was a super smart guy when he was here, and he's pursuing his dreams. And not everybody's dreams are the same. And I think I would love to work for NASA, but for my kids to work for NASA, I think that's so cool.
So I put this in my special teams preview for training camp. Do you know what is significant about the number 2 when it comes to long snapper Justin Holloway?
No, what is that?
The transfer from Ohio. That's how many points he's already scored at Arizona Stadium for catching a 2-point conversion of a fake PAT. He was snapping for the Ohio Bobcats in the Arizona Bowl.
Oh,
and
yeah. I remember that play. Okay.
Yeah, now he's playing for Arizona.
Oh, fascinating. Okay. That does happen on occasion where guys have played in the Arizona Bowl and now they're back here.
Oh,
Brent Brennan coached in Arizona Stadium.
Oh, that's right.
It's part of an Arizona Bowl that almost wasn't because of COVID.
Yeah.
They barely had enough players to play that day, and they kind of got run over by Ball State.
Yep.
But yeah, so occasionally you're sort of like, you think someone's making their debut at Arizona Stadium, but they aren't necessarily making their debut because they've been here before as part of the Arizona Bowl.
Well, like Big Stanley at USC, the season opener, Stanley was on the field playing for USC in 2020, the COVID year, where it was just only 5 Pac-12 games for Arizona, and that first game against USC, and Arizona took it to USC. They almost won that game.
Do you know how close Arizona came to winning that game? Do you remember what happened? Like on that last drive, like Christian Roland Wallace basically had an interception, and the ball went right through his hands, and it was caught and USC ended up scoring the go-ahead touchdown. Would everything have changed if Arizona wins that game against USC?
Oh man,
that's one of those. That's a sliding doors moment right there.
Butterfly effect. Man, that and Jaden Delores' ankle. Just 2 things that have completely changed the trajectory of Arizona football.
I'm shocked that that's not its own Twitter account. Jaden Delores' ankle.
Like Kurt Kreis's headband. All right, well, that is enough football talk for us. We appreciate you guys for listening. Football is right around the corner. We got training camp starting up this week. Myself, Michael Lev, we will be representing the Arizona Daily Star at training camp. Follow all of our coverage on Tucson.com and the Wildcaster app. We'll see you next time.